we're going to dive into verbal reasoning. So what is it? Basically, here's kind of one definition of verbal reading, but it's really, like I said, it's about inferencing and background knowledge, but it's really about being able to problem solve, read between the lines, figure out things in the text that are not obvious. And this is a really hard skill, really has to be very, very intentionally taught and developed with our students. So here's some examples of verbal reasoning. So one example of that is figuring out who the pronouns are referring to in a text. That seems really easy sometimes, but it's actually not. A lot of times it's pretty complicated. And so we assume that, people know that Molly, she, and her are all the same person. But that could be really confusing for some of our learners. Putting in information that the author doesn't include, right? It never said anywhere that Molly spilt her juice, right? But we have to definitely add some background knowledge here with some of that information. And then obviously the use of figurative language by an author or a speaker. So those are some examples of verbal reasoning. So we're going to just kind of start with making inferences, right? This is one of my all-time favorite topics. So sorry if I gave you too much today, but I love it. Super fun to teach, but not that easy. And making inferences, even though it doesn't really show up as a word in fourth grade until fourth grade in our standards, it really starts with our young ones, because making inferences really needs to be built over time. But we start with, images, right? Or just pictures from the text that we're reading, or just even beginning the conversation about, well, what do you think you know about this? So it really has to be built with our young students as well. Kids make inferences pretty well. It's just hard to get them to do it within a text. Because if you put a birthday cake, birthday hats, and presents on a table, and they walk into a classroom, they will make an inference. So they do have that skill to make an inference at a young age. It's just harder to do it with text. One of the things that makes inferences so difficult is that there's so many kinds. So the first thing that we want to think about when teaching our students how to infer is we need to be super clear on what type of inference we're asking them to make, and then teach them how to do that. Because each of these inferences actually require us to look for different types of text clues. So I actually highly recommend that you only focus on one inference type at a time. Let's work on inferences about the setting today. Don't try to do too many, because we're jumping around, with it then. Helping them to understand what type of text clues and what type of background knowledge we would use as we work on that type of inference. So if it's location, I'm going to be looking for words that are about a place, right? I'm going to be looking for descriptive words that describe what something looks like, and those types of things. So zooming in on one or two types of inferences with a text or over a period of time can actually help students get really much better at it, but also being really clear about what type of inference you want them to make. So I want you to make an inference about the character. So let's talk about that. Because a lot of times we just, when you read a piece of text, there's 50 different inferences in that text. We're never super clear about that with our students. We kind of just walk you through samples of different types of inferences. So here's an example where we're being asked to infer a location. Where does this taking place? It never ever says it's at the beach, but there's all these clues around it. There's swimming, right? There's water, there's sand castles, so it's not a pool, and those types of things. So really lifting sentences out of text with students and pointing out to those specific details, putting that together with what we know. Where do you do sand castles? Usually at the beach. Let's put those together in order to make an inference about where they spent the afternoon. Sometimes we do inferences about character traits or roles or relationships, and we can make all sorts of inferences, Garfield. We also infer time. When did this take place? It could be time of day, it could be a season, it could be recent history, it could be a long time ago, right? So there's lots of clues in this image. Back to school, well, it's probably when? In the fall. You're holding a book. How do you turn this thing on? Well, clearly this is an enduring technology. So getting students to notice these types of details helps them learn how to make an inference. Actions and events are some. This one, obviously, they're talking about big red shoes, bright yellow outfits, but you'll see how much background knowledge plays into this. So this one is clearly talking about an empty bag and went out into the night with all this clothing on. Well, okay, when do I dress up? When do I take a bag? There might be Halloween. So there's lots of opportunities for our learners to have to infer. We sometimes, here's another action and event. We have tickets, popcorn, and candy. Never says what we're doing, right? But we are definitely making an inference that they're going to the movies. Sometimes we categorize, and this starts moving us into main idea, but what are all infer relationships? Right, so Monopoly, checkers, and Scrabble, they're all games. So this passage is obviously talking about games. So that's also the type of inference that we make. And then here's the pronoun referent as well. Who are they? Who are those people? Who are they talking about? And this one, they're doing ancestral Pavlovians. We also infer cause effect. We grab raincoats and umbrellas. Why? It must be raining outside if we do that. And then we sometimes infer problems and solutions. So there's the trees or wind. So what was the problem? There's obviously some kind of windstorm. We infer feelings and attitude. And we do that a lot with faces or words or descriptive language about what the character's doing. And so we, a lot of times, are inferring emotion or how somebody feels about a topic. And then we also infer viewpoint. How does an author feel about the subject? Are they really pro John Glenn? Or are they advocates for this topic, right? Especially when we're reading arguments. Sometimes we have to infer an object. So these are all quotes from texts that I found. So it never says it's a book, but we have to make that inference. And then also, sometimes we have to infer vocabulary words. So this is where we start weaving with that vocabulary strand. So far we've woven with background knowledge and we're weaving with vocabulary too. What if we don't know that word? So we can use some of this information to infer what the meaning of that word is. So using context clues. So, and there's more. Those were just like my 12 favorite. We also infer main idea, we infer theme, I mean, there's a ton. So I think the number one thing we always need to be clear on is what type of inferring are we wanting students to do? How can we show them how to do that, explicitly teach them, guide them to the type of text details and how to think about their prior knowledge to support that. So what are some ways that we can do this? Again, I always recommend you, I think you guys all know me well enough. What's 5 minutes we can do on something nice and simple that we can embed into what you're already doing. So I'm going to share a bunch of different ways you might do it. None of them are complicated, but I'm just going to throw a few out there. And then hopefully you'll find one that will work for you to really work on explicitly teaching and helping kids practice with their verbal reasoning. So here's our list, but I'm going to go right into like examples of that. So those of you following along. So first of all, make sure they know what the word inference means, right? Like they don't always know what that word means. A lot of times we assume that vocabulary knowledge is, yes, I agree, definitely. So we definitely need to work on just the meaning of the word, giving them examples and non-examples, and getting kids just to interact with the understanding of it. You guys know I love Freyer models, so I put it in a Freyer model. Don't have to do it that way, but that is one of the strategies that I absolutely love. But just getting them to talk about it. Would this be an inference? Would this not be an inference? And kind of making sense of that for them. The second thing is maybe use a routine. Every time we want to make a routine, and whatever your routine is, doesn't matter. Here's one routine if it's helpful. But you want to think about, well, what's the question? Like, what do I want to know is an inferential question, right? Let's read the passage. What do we know about this, right? Any clues that we can find, any details, and then what do we know? And then kind of putting that together, see if we can get some information. So just giving them some type of routine that you prompt them through will be really, really helpful for your students if you do it the same way all the time, so that they know what to do when you aren't there, right? That's our goal, is to always give them a routine or a strategy so that they can, tackle it without us. Sometimes it's helpful to teach students that there are different types of questions and making sure they know the difference. Because sometimes they think that a question is going to be right in the text and they don't realize it's an inferential question. So I'm pulling out an oldie but goodie strategy, but it is one of my favorites. So some of you that have been in the profession as long as I have, you will recognize this, I hope. So if you're not still using it, bring it back. I love QAR, or question answer relationships. And so basically with the QAR strategies, you actually teach students to read the question and determine where they would find that answer. Is that an answer that's right there in the text that I can point to? The answer, is it literal? Or do I have to look in a couple of different places in the text? That's think and search, but it's still literal. The answer is in the text. Inferencing is the in my head, and that is, well, I have to read the text, and do I have to add information from my prior knowledge? And so those are inferential questions. So giving them, kind of that framework to think about. And then I threw in a video in here if anybody wants to, I always give you a ton of resources, watching a teacher introducing QAR. So if that's something you're not familiar with, I think you'll enjoy that video. It was really nice to watch somebody teach students the 4 types of questions. And then, so when I was in the classroom, we used to actually annotate the questions using these images. So we would actually read the questions and talk about it. Like, do we think that's a right there question? If it was, we just put a little arrow. And then we would put a little arrow in the text when we were annotating too, right? Like, here's the answer, is in this line or in this paragraph. We use it because whatever icons you want to use is fine. These are just ones that I use. So I find that is very helpful, just to get them to think about what the question is and where they might find the answer. But just being really, really aware that sometimes it's the author, what the author's saying, but it's also with what you know and your prior knowledge. Here's some pictures of people using QAR in their classroom. And so teaching students that there's above the surface questions and below the surface questions. And the inferential questions, usually, not always, but a lot of times, are how, why, what, could, would, should, those types of questions. So sometimes teaching students some of those signal words, but you can't make it a hard and fast rule, because I have seen what questions that are inferential as well. Sometimes it's a little bit helpful to kind of support students with that. So one of my very favorite strategies is teaching inferencing with pictures. But again, when you do this, focus in. Let's see who can make an inference. So we're going to work on time. So can anybody make an inference, willing to unmute and make an inference about time? And when did this painting, what does it represent?
I will. So are you asking about like time in history or the time when this was painted?
Either.
Okay, well, I'm thinking that it is somewhere in the late 1800s because of how the people are dressed, and with the little bustle in the back for the, or not little, they're not little at all. Bustles in the back, the hats on everybody, even the children are kind of in that more, that dress from the time.
Love it. Thank you so much for giving your evidence, right? So it's another great way to have kids give evidence, right? Which is a huge part of our standard right now. So great. So we have an inference about when this occurred in history. What's another time inference we could make today with this picture?
The picture is taking place mid-morning or afternoon. We can tell that by the lighting and the shadows over several of the characters.
I love it. They also have umbrellas.
Right.
So the sun is out, right? Yeah. Love that. That's great. Any other inferences we can make?
It was around lunchtime, around 1, just because the lady sitting down, the gentleman is smoking his pipe. It looks like she has maybe something that she was eating beside her, or that could just be her sewing. But it looks like everybody's kind of like on a break. It's like a break time.
Yeah. So what season might it be?
I would infer that it's late spring, early summer, because they still have some of the dresses are long sleeves. And
yeah, that's great. Love it.
Also, they're rowing and sailing. They would do that in the winter.
I would infer that's happening on a weekend. because I see people of all ages and all, men and women. So I'm thinking it's a time when there's not a lot of work going on.
I love it. Look at all the great inferences you made just by looking at an image, right? So just getting kids to talk about inferencing, right? And doing one inference at a time. And you can just use any image from any text that you're reading with students, right? I just put this in because I love this painting. So I always use it, but just getting them to produce language about inferencing. And so if we start with the images, then we can build it to text, but it gets them used to the thinking that's needed for verbal reasoning. And so especially for my K1, 2 teachers, a lot of times we're thinking we don't teach inferencing. You don't have a standard on it, but we can begin the conversation by looking at an image, right? And getting our students' brains to be thinking about this, right? That there's a lot of text clues that we have in pictures and videos and in the text as well. All right, I'll move on. That's my favorite slide though, so sorry. So you can do this if you want kind of what's going on. If you ever have 5 minutes or after recess, like what's going on in this picture? What do you think? And down here, I gave you a link to a whole collection of photos. If you need them, these come from the New York Times. They actually have the photos and the questions written for you. So these can be just really great prompts for kids to get them curious and thinking about it. And then you could obviously take it to writing as well, or conversations. You can use comic strips. And again, I gave you a link to a collection of comic strips if that's something that you like, especially if your kids love comics, you can use lots of different strategies. And then you can also use, there's a whole collection of Pixar short films that have no words in them. So I've given you links, all of these hyperlink to the videos. So if you'd like, you can use video clips. So same thing. So these are all just different ways to really develop this concept of inferencing. And you can zoom in on the different types depending on what you want to focus on with your students. So I think one of the most important practices is helping them do this with graphic organizers. So what learners can sometimes struggle with is understanding that there's text details, which is its own set of challenges, right? But it also, you have to use what you already know and you have to put them together. That's actually what an inference is. So using some type of graphic organizer, this is one of my favorites. Here's another one though, if it's helpful for you. Question, I like that addition. What's the text say? What do I know? Therefore, I think. So whichever organizer works best for you is fine. This is actually from my classroom. It's a really old picture. So, but this is what I used to do with my students, right? What I read, my prior knowledge, and therefore what is my inference. So just doing lots of work with students on this. And you don't have to do a ton every day. Like I said, put 5 minutes of this in your day every day. Here's one for characters, which I really liked. What are some of the characters' actions? What are some of your experiences about that? And therefore, what can we infer about that character? We can do an ABC inference, part of the text, because of the evidence, and then make a connection or an inference. So there's just a few for you and some pictures that I found. Here's another one with a photo. Here's another one, evidence, schema, inference. So I really like that academic language on that one. So that's why I put that one in as well. So I think, and I love that, this is really cool too. It says in the text, I say from my prior knowledge, and so I infer. So those would be some really nice language frames that you could teach your students and get them just producing language and practicing, talking about the type of inferences they have. And there's some more language frames for you if needed. I always like to give you guys resources. Then there's pull a passage. This one is really helpful too. I love this one. You want to get more into the citation, what passage, what page is it on, and what's your inference? The author didn't say this. So it kind of takes another approach, not what the author did say, but what the author didn't say. But I know this because of these clues and my own experience. So again, it's about getting them to understand how they make the inferences, getting them to verbalize it or write about it is really going to strengthen their ability to do verbal reasoning. And then I also gave you a set of questions that you can use while reading. I actually love making inferences before we read a text. What can we infer from the cover, the title, the genre, anything that we do in our initial browse? What background knowledge do I have? Can we make any inferences before we read? And then what can we infer while we're reading? And so again, it's more just prompting them. So these are just some prompts that you can use with some of your students, and then continuing after the fact, right? What did you infer? What helped you? What text clues did you notice? You know, what background knowledge did you use? Getting them to reflect back on how they were able to make those inferences is a really, really great conversation as well. And then we can also do this with writing. It can also be used to really support inferencing, using the show, don't tell strategy. When you're working on writing with students or writing revision, I used to do this in revision time, but we would take one sentence from their writing. Obviously I would model it, we'd do it together, and then over time I'd build this with them. But then they had to say the same thing without telling us literally what happened. Really fun strategy. And then they can create those and then share it with a partner. So instead of Brian was angry, he started to yell, Brian pursed his lips. So we talk about how would you say angry without saying angry? So he pursed his lip, clenched his fist into tight balls. Try as he might, he could not contain himself. Within seconds, he erupted like a volcano. And so working on, so I love, I found some pictures here that I wanted to share with you that were really helpful. I love this one because it gives you other ways to say certain words, right? How can you say afraid? How can you say nervous, right? So that's a nice scaffold for kids. So picking like one of those and helping them like kind of revise a sentence with that. So taking it to writing is going to strengthen it when they're reading, right? So if they can do it themselves, then when they see it in writing, we can say, well, the author's showing, not telling. What are they showing us instead? And then making that connection really helps them. So here again, here's another example of show versus tell. So I just love all this descriptive language. So when you're working on descriptive language with kids, that can be great. So Princess, you're going to dive in on figurative language is another one, or did you?
Yes, no problem.
Okay.
Just keeping on our journey with verbal reasoning, we just thought we'd throw in a little bit about figurative language. Many of you are very much aware of figurative language. So I found two pretty good definitions that I like. So either one works. But the biggest thing is that figurative language is it just gives the kids a way to see what the author is saying. It makes it more powerful for them. It makes them connect more to figurative language, makes them, so we were talking about verbal language, we're talking about vocabulary, so that really it just gives them a good imagery and helps to build on what they already know. And it does help to make them make connections, sometimes sooner. So I love figurative language. Like Molly loves, I love figurative language. Here are all types. And every time I'm looking at it, there are even more. There's like symbolism and some other ones that are not on this list. But these are the most common ones for the most part. These are the most common ones that students engage in school. From elementary, they're usually doing simile, metaphor, onomatopoeia, personification. That's usually in hyperbole. Those are usually the most common ones for elementary. And in high school, they do those, but they also do alliteration, allusion. They do idiom. And understatement is interesting. That one is not a common one because it's really hard to get them to see it. But secondary, they do use it. I've taught it in secondary, and there are many holes that you would see understatement in secondary literature. And so here's just some examples of figurative language. This is a copy from Classroom. I just had snapped a picture of, and just some visual examples of what figurative language could be. This one, like oxymoron, or which is another one that's not on the list, but it is a type of figurative language, right? It's raining cats and dogs, because a lot of our language learners, to be honest with you, can struggle with, because they may not have familiarity with, some of the figurative language that we use. And so taking time to help work with students and teach them what figurative language is, showing examples, letting them see it in writing, in the reading that they do in their textbooks. It really does help bring home their understanding of figurative language and how fun it could be, and how it really does bring alive text that they're reading. One is for elementary, one is for secondary. There's a ton on the internet in terms of looking for really good examples to help support instruction and understanding figurative language. So I just put two there just so that you have an idea, but I'm sure You could search Google, search YouTube's, and there are a bunch out there. Here are some strategies that I use in teaching figurative language, and by trade and by practice, I am a secondary teacher. So for me in teaching figurative language, these are 4 or 5 of the things that I have done in teaching my students figurative language. And I have done elementary younger kids as well. So these are tried and true for me. And then Molly talked about, she mentioned something earlier about routine, like in teaching inferences and how you can make it a part of a routine. So when you're looking at it in terms of how to teach it explicitly, and when they encounter it in literature and in text or in conversations and discourse that you're having with students, try to make sure you highlight those things, because it really does make the connection to what they're reading and then helps them understand. Using figurative language and writing, which is so cool to have them write it, because then that really helps you understand that they understand if they're able to pull it and put it into writing. Incorporating it into like daily routine that you do, like as you're doing your one teacher I saw, there's like their morning routine, and they were working on it, and so she used it as part of her morning routine. I then got to see her use some of it in writing. I got to see how she had the students draw as well, to have an image to it. So it really is helpful when trying to tie in that meaning and understanding of text that they're engaged in, and there's figurative language. And then create literacy stations. I've seen where they've had learning stations or rotation stations for literacy, stations for figurative language. In high school and middle school, you will most likely see like learning walls, or they'll have good examples up, and they'll have things on the walls that the students can refer to in their writing and their reading. And so of course, we could not leave without having a Frere model. And so here are some examples of how to use various figurative language and examples and using the Frere model. And so here are some ways in which figurative language, and when you're doing it, I love this, is to collect examples from students and put them on the wall. Now for high school and middle school, I would do that as well. But of course, their examples would be a little different. But I think it's such a cool way to reinforce their understanding and their learning, is to display their work and put it out where they can see it, so they can feel really good about what they know and how they were able to make connections. Yes. Here are some resources, and these are just some links to some figurative language resources for secondary. I think when you click that, it just goes to an example of a poem that uses figurative language. There's short stories. So I tried to give you elementary and secondary because I'm secondary, so I'm always thinking secondary and elementary. I wear both hats. There's there's great music out there for them to engage in, and elementary kids, they love it. You find figurative language where they can dance and hop and sing. They will really enjoy it. And some of the games, like the Get One, Give One, in terms of exchanging and doing matches for figurative language, great hands-on kinds of things. Alternative. So this is Word Wall, and this is kind of a little crazy thing I did. And you can add images to it. So some English language learners who you're really supporting with language and have a picture next to the figurative language item really works. And then they just pick from the bottom row which one it is. So it might be right, and it'll tell you. So now, connecting to everything else, Molly's going to bring it on home, and we're going to talk about bringing it all together using closed reading.
So yeah, I just wanted to put it in context, because I know close reading is a strategy that we all use. I just want to show like where this kind of fits. So as you already know, close reading kind of strives to answer these 4 questions, and we go into the text multiple times. I usually do the inference and figurative language in a later read. I don't usually do it in a first read, because first read is really more getting the gist, the general understanding of the text. What does it say? How is it organized, and those types of things. And I also wanted to connect it to the standards, right? So as we think about it, usually our first entry is just kind of what the text say. We're reading for details, themes, those types of things. As we dig deeper into a text, so you might just do it in smaller chunks, right? You don't have to read the whole text, but you might take little small pieces of the text and really do some figurative language work, or really do some deep inference work. So we wouldn't do it with the whole text usually, but really try to keep picking some key passages. And again, I just put the standards in because I want you just to notice that even though it doesn't say inferencing, a lot of these things you have to do. You have to inference to do that, kind of like describe a character. Well, sometimes you have to infer about the character. They don't always give us all the details. So in our K through 2 standards, we are really laying the foundation for it. And so sometimes they're going to be literal and sometimes they're going to be inferential. Okay. I just thought I'd just kind of show you a sample with the Day the Crayons Quit. So we're not going to watch the movie. We're not going to watch it. But if you've never read this book, here's an audio of it. It's one of my very favorite books. I just wanted to show you ways we can just take a text and really dig into it and ask some inferential questions. So for those of you that don't know, all of the crayons in his crayon box write him a letter telling them why they're unhappy. It's like the greatest book ever, right? So here's the red one, and they're tired of being overworked on the holidays, right? And which is great for Valentine's Day. You can just kind of get kids to dig in, you know, what are they arguing about? Because it doesn't always tell you. Sometimes there's some inferencing. Prior knowledge, how do all these crayons feel? What prior knowledge are you using? So this is a great book to teach the inference of emotion or feeling and getting to talk about how would you feel if that was happening, right? And using that prior knowledge, you know, and then we can also use images. The illustrator does a great time of using faces. Again, so we can do that, especially with our younger students, right? When we show them how to like draw something, they want to show an emotion, showing them how to draw a face or using the illustrator's drawing to kind of make an inference as well. So I just thought you guys might like to see like a sample of a text where you're really just kind of digging into inferencing. And with this book, it's super fun. If you want to use it, you can do one color a day. Again, you don't have to do one every day. You don't have to do the whole book at one time. And I love this last question. How does Duncan's response tell us what is important to him? So it's really getting to viewpoint. And so it really takes it up to a much higher level. And what can we learn from the crayons? Just I wanted to share that with you. Okay. And then getting kids to write about it. So here's, you know, what a child wrote about it.